Hi, welcome to this video on constants and variables. So, constants and variables are ways of storing things within Swift. You can think of them as magic boxes. A variable is a magic box with an opening lid. You can change the contents of the box or you can empty it. A constant, also known as a let, is a box with a locked lid. So once you've filled it with something and the lid has been closed, that's it, it's shut forever, you can't change the content. So both are declared in a very similar way. So you can see here, we declare a variable with the keyword var, V-A-R. The name that we're going to assign to our variable, our magic box, and then the contents that we're going to put within that box. And then below we've got a constant, which is declared with the keyword let, L-E-T. We've got a magic box with a locked lid, which has the contents of a constant. Now let's have a look and see what happens when we try and change that constant. So we see here we put magic box and we put a new variable content. When we look over into the right here, we can see it's executed that perfectly. Now if we just uncomment this and see what happens when we try and change the contents of the constant, we can see that immediately we get a failure and we get an error message because we've tried to change the contents of a constant and Swift doesn't allow us to do that. So let's comment that out again. So if you're wondering why we'd want to use a constant and why we wouldn't just put everything in variable and keep that ability to be able to change it as and when we please, it's all about maintaining the security of your code. So certain items within your code are going to be a set value and they're going to stay that set value throughout. So let's use pi as an example. So here we create a constant of pi and it equals 3.14. Now the value of pi doesn't change, it's always 3.14. But whilst we're working throughout our code, instead of typing 3.14 every time we want to do a calculation using pi, we can set up a constant so that we can use just the word pi and we know that we never have any typing errors. Now if we uncomment this, we can see here where we try and change this constant, and in this example we've actually done a typo, we've put 31.4. It's blocking us from changing that constant and keeping us safe and secure in our code. Also, it prevents something accidentally changing the value of your code. So for instance, you could be doing a calculation using pi. So there we've just added 1 onto pi. Now we could accidentally type that wrong and we could, put pi in there. And now all of a sudden we've changed pi to equal pi plus 1. Ignore all these warning messages that are coming up whilst I'm just typing this example. But using constants allows us to keep that safety and it makes our code a lot stronger and a lot more able to withstand any typing errors. We can change the contents of a variable. We can open the lid on the magic box and we can change the content. So here we've created a variable called we can change this. We've assigned it 1 and then we've opened the lid of the box and we've put a number 2 in there. Now look what happens when we try and change that to the word 3. So we've opened up our magic box, we've taken out the number 2 and we put the word 3 in there. But Swift has declared an error, it's not allowed us to do this. And that's because variables have a type. So Swift, like I said, it uses magic boxes for variables. And as soon as you put something in that magic box, Swift determines what it is and it shapes that box to fit that type. So here we declared a variable and we called it a 1. Now 1 is an integer, so Swift has automatically looked at that 1 and said this variable is of type integer. Let's say integer is a square box, so it's made the magic box square. So we've tried to put another integer in, also square, and it's fitting the box perfectly. Here we tried to put a string into the integer box. Now let's say a string is round. Now our round object can no longer fit in our square box, so we've got an error here. And we get the same error again when we try and put, this time, a double into our integer box, because again a double is a different type, it's a different shape box and it won't fit in our square box. Now, once a type has been assigned to a variable, or even a constant, that type cannot be changed. It's set in stone and it's not something that you can move around. So as long as we stick to the right types for the right variables, here we've put a 3 in the integer shaped box and everything is working fine. So let's just comment out these errors. So we've got a clean running code again. Now, there might be times in your code when you want to specifically state what the type of variable you want it to be, rather than allowing Swift to automatically assign what it thinks is the most relevant. And this is pretty simple to do. After the name of the variable, we use a semicolon, the type of variable we want it to be, and then we add the value in there. So there we've set this variable as a double, and we set this one as an integer. In terms of the types of variables you can use, there's a whole host of different types. Here are some of the more basic ones. So we have an int or integer, and that's any whole number between minus 2,147,000,000 and positive 2,147,000,000. Now that's on a 32-bit platform. It's an even larger range on a 64-bit platform. So as you can see, an integer is going to be big enough to hold most numbers. A decimal float, which is declared using the keyword float, is a decimal number. So 2.0, 2.1 would also work in there, 2.1687, any sorts of numbers where you got a decimal point. What's interesting is if you put a number without a decimal point, it will also accept it. And what it's doing there is it's taking that number as 2.0. And this means that you can use whole numbers in calculations with other float numbers, so other decimal numbers. Next you've got a double, which is very similar to a float. It's a decimal number, but it's a 64-bit version, so it can hold a much longer number range. In most cases, you'd use a double. You have a character, which is a single character. So there we've used A, but it can be any of the alphabetical letters, you can have numbers, and also some other of the keyboard characters. String, which is a length of text or numbers. However, if you do use numbers within the string, you can't use them for mathematical calculations. For instance, if I called this string 6, and then I tried to add this 6 to the integer, I'd get an error because we're trying to add what is effectively text to a number. And finally, we've got bool. Now, bool is a binary option, which means it's either a 1 or a 0, or in other words, true or false. So it's a switch that's either off or on. We've also got another type of variable, which is called an array. Now, an array is a stacked storage system for a set of data. So here we've declared an array. Within the array, we've put a multitude of values. So we put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And what we could do is we can actually call those individually. Now, an array always starts from 0. So where we put 1 there, that will be object 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And when I say it's a stack, if you took 5 out of there, then 6 would drop down and it would take the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4th position. And here we can see, so if we print an array, we put in the square brackets there, 0, we're looking at the 1 at position 0, we get a number 1. If we print an array at position 1, again, we get the number 2 there. So change that to position 4, you see we get the number 5. So an array is quite complex, it's quite difficult to get your head around at first, but once you do, it's a very useful tool. So there's a very specific style that people use when naming variables in Swift. Now this is a style, it's not compulsory, but it is recommended because there is a very good reason behind it. And that is to use as descriptive a name as possible when naming your variables, even if it becomes a very long variable name. Because of the introduction of autocomplete, whenever you start typing a variable now anyway, Swift and Xcode will actually help you autocomplete that. So long variable names aren't that much of a burden, but they are actually a really good benefit because they help you understand what that variable is used for. So I've just put a little example up here on the screen. So you can see here, I've got a variable that sets the time for the sprinklers to come on. And we set that for 1 o'clock in the morning. It's a sensible time, it's nice and dark, nobody's about. Good time to water the grass. We also want to set a time for the alarm to wake me up in the morning. So set this one as 7 o'clock in the morning. I've called this one the time, and I've called the time for the sprinklers to come on just time. Now where we're going to get issues here, so here we've built a very basic method. Don't worry about understanding how this works, but basically we're going to say sound the alarm at the time that's passed to this function. So later on, if you imagine this is quite a complex application and we're perhaps in a different Swift file now, or we're 3 or 4 pages down the screen, we want to call that function. So we say alarm sound, and we start typing in a variable and we go, oh yeah, time. We want the alarm to sound at the time. So we run that function, and the alarm sounds at, it's dropped the 0 off there, but at 1 o'clock in the morning. But we didn't want the alarm to go off at 1 o'clock in the morning. That's way too early. We don't need to get up till 7. But because we've not called this a nice logical name, we've got confused and we've ended up with a bit of an error that's going to cause us 6 hours worth of sleep. So what would be better would be to rename these variables as time for sprinklers to activate. Then we're going to call this one the time for the alarm to go off. Now when we call this function now, if we just get rid of that old variable name, we can go, we want it to go, the time for the alarm to go off. That's more sensible, and we can see now that the alarm goes off at 0700 rather than at 0100. So calling your variables a nice descriptive name. It might take a little bit more typing at first, but like I say, autocomplete helps take away most of that time, and it will help you save any errors by ambiguously named variables. You might also have noticed this strange sort of style of text that I'm using to name things. So it's a sort of a constant sentence without any spaces in. This is known as camel case. So here we go, we have a variable called camel case, and basically the first letter of each word is spelt with a capital, with the exception of the first word. And what it does is it just helps able to get very long sort of names, which is still quite easily readable. Imagine if you try and write this without using the capitals in there, it becomes very difficult to sort of see and understand. And one of the reasons that this is used is because you can't use spaces within your variable names. So if I take that there and try and put a space in there, all of a sudden we've got an error. Swift expects things to come in a certain order. So here it expects a variable, it knows it's declaring a variable, the variable name. What it's expecting next would be either a colon and then a variable type, or it's expecting an equal sign and then a value. But what it's not expecting is another word, because it thinks the name has ended there and the space has then moved on to the next item. So you don't use spaces in variable names. But what we can use are underscores. So here we've got a variable, we've called it a underscore variable. You can see that that one works. And we can use as many underscores as we want. So this is actually called snake case as opposed to camel case. I mean, again, it's a style thing. You're able to use whichever one you prefer. Most people use camel case. If you read all of the Apple developer docs, all the examples will be in camel case. But again, it's your call. So there are some other rules about what you can and can't use in variable names. So here we're going to show you that you can't use a number to start a variable. So there we've used variable 3D, and we have a problem. So if we start any variable name with a number, it's going to give us an error. But you can see if we change that to a3D, it works perfectly fine because we've not used a number. As you can see on the next example, using numbers within the name is perfectly fine as long as it's not the first character of the name. So that's when we get an error. Another thing that you can't use in the name are certain reserved words. So there's a long list of these. So in this one we can see we've tried to create a variable and call it var. Well, Swift already knows the term var as a declaration for a new variable. So it's reading that and it's going, oh, you tried to declare this variable twice. And I don't like that. So it's creating an error. So again, we can put anything in there. It stops it being that reserved word and it accepts it. Now there's a long list of reserved words. I won't try and go through them for you now. You'll know as you type them because you'll get an error. Just try changing the name to something. If you are using the advice above to use very long, very descriptive names, then it's unlikely you're going to use a reserved word anyway. Reserved words are generally quite short and very specific. So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please click the like button. If you want to see more like this, please click on subscribe to get notified about future videos. Thanks a lot.